Hi, I'm Femi Oke and you're in the stream. Today, the United Nations has been accused of knowing about alleged sexual abuse of children by French troops in the Central African Republic, but not doing enough to reveal those incidents. We look at how the UN handles accusations like this. So we have a lot of international organizations in our community watching right now. A lot of people from the UN also watching right now, very keen to see what happens in this conversation. Malika Blau is our digital producer. What do you have for us?
A lot of people who are really knowledgeable about things like this. And so we asked our community how UN peacekeeping forces are viewed in their country. Here's just one answer. This is from a resident of Uganda who talks about peacekeeping troops in Somalia. Now, we'll discuss this, of course. We'll talk about the reporting of allegations like this and what follows. Of course, we want you to join in on that. You can tweet us with #AJStream.
Joining us here on our set is James Wasserstrom. He's a United States diplomat and a former whistleblower who exposed corruption by senior UN officials in Kosovo. James, it's great to have you here in the conversation.
Thank you.
And we'll hear more from you and our other guests in just a moment.
Hi, I'm Melissa Fleming, and I'm the chief spokesperson for UNHCR, and I'm in the stream.
Last summer, Anders Kompass, a senior UN employee, gave French authorities a confidential UN report on the alleged sexual exploitation of children in the Central African Republic, claiming his bosses had failed to take action to stop the abuses. Now, the report includes testimonies of a number of children, some as young as 8, who said they were raped at a camp for internally displaced people in exchange for food and money. While the UN said the abuses took place before its peacekeeping mission in the CAR officially began, the UN's own internal report accuses the organisation of having, I'm going to quote here, a culture of silence, end of quote, when it comes to revealing abuses or misconduct. Kompass was suspended for breaching protocol, but was later reinstated when an appeals tribunal found his suspension to be unlawful. The UN has refused to label Kompass's actions as whistleblowing, claiming he compromised the identity of the child victims and witnesses mentioned in the report. But some former UN employees have come out to suggest that the Kompass case shows how the UN deals with whistleblowers. So to help us talk about this, we're also joined by Farhan Haq. He's the Deputy Spokesperson for the UN Secretary General. Mukesh Kapila is a former UN coordinator for Sudan. He's currently a professor of global health and humanitarian affairs at Manchester University. And Shelley Warden is consultant with the Government Accountability Project, a whistleblower protection and advocacy organisation. So good to have you here, everybody. Farhan, this case with Kompass, where we're looking at not a UN issue, but a UN communication issue, why was he in trouble for telling the French that they had a problem with their troops? Can you explain it for our international audience? Why would he be in trouble for doing that?
Well, I'll try to, but first of all, I hope you have some tolerance for the fact that because this is a case that's still underway, I don't want to say anything that's prejudicial,
of course,
towards his case.
Sure, absolutely.
Having said that, what we have said, and we've been very clear about this, is that this has to do with our concerns about how the evidence that we collect has been handled. As you know, in all of these sorts of investigations, what we have is investigators on the ground getting testimony from people who are oftentimes in a situation of great risk. In a place like the Central African Republic, these are small children, some as young as 9 years old, who are child victims. You have witnesses who sometimes give us testimony only on condition of anonymity. And then the question is, were the confidence that they placed in us, was that breached in some way or another? So we want to make sure for the witnesses, for the investigators, and in particular for the victims themselves, that the way the evidence was handled respected their basic rights. Otherwise, we have a problem in that regard. So we're looking into that. At the same time, I want to make it very clear that this really shouldn't be seen as an effort to silence someone for speaking up about the atrocities. I mean, that is a very serious thing, and we want that followed up on. We've tried to do that ourselves. The investigators on the ground are the ones who brought this to light. It was the people from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and from UNICEF who did these interviews and who tried to make sure that it was followed up. And what we need to determine is, first of all, did we follow up properly? And second of all, did we do it in such a way that respects the victims and the witnesses themselves?
So you're still trying to work that out. There is a procedure for unveiling misconduct at the United Nations that you encourage staff to go through. What should they do? What is the official procedure? Because Anders Kompass isn't considered to be a whistleblower by the United Nations.
Part of that is has to do with the timing of when he put out information. We'll have to see how and when the information was put out. So again, I don't want to say anything prejudicial about this.
Right.
But the initial information seemed to be that the evidence was put out quickly before senior officials were even informed.
Sure, but there's some
that
issues
remains
with
to be investigated.
Peacekeeping forces in the UN anyway. There's a report.
Well, let's separate the issue of peacekeeping forces from the UN from this particular case.
And that's what
Remember,
I'm moving on from.
This does not involve UN peacekeepers.
Because I know you can't talk about...
This was a case of UN investigators finding out allegations of wrongdoing about French peacekeepers who are not part of a UN operation.
Absolutely. So I'm moving on because there's only so much you can talk about this case. Yeah. But there are issues with peacekeeping forces, peacekeeping troops, and what do you do when people bring up issues that make the UN peacekeeping force look bad?
And we've tried to get in place a culture where people will speak up about this, and also that we have conduct and discipline units in all the peacekeeping operations trying to examine and make sure that all peacekeeping soldiers, police, whomever, civilian staff abide by the rules and are not culpable for any sexual abuse or exploitation. And as far as the statistics we've been able to accumulate on this over the years has been, we've been making headway. Even just a few years ago, you would have sometimes more than 100 reported cases, whereas last year there was 53 reported cases, and so far this year, up through now, we have about 15. The trend has been downwards, and regularly downwards, consistently downwards over the course of the past decade. The question is that enough? And the answer is right now, no. We still need to change the entire culture by which the UN operates so that people do speak up about this, and the conduct and discipline units are able to make headway in dealing with these issues, and that follow-up action is taken by the member states.
I just want to pick up on that line you said, talking about changing that culture and moving forward. We got a tweet here from Leonard who talks about that procedure and what happens when you want to whistleblow, basically. Leonard says, if you put forward suggestions or concerns in the organization, do you feel you receive serious, transparent feedback? So, James, I want to go to you with this tweet because this was you. You put forward information that you believed needed to be addressed. What happened?
Well, I would say the culture at that time, and I would argue that it exists to this day, is that people who pop their heads up above ground to report serious misconduct get their heads chopped off. I mean, my particular case is exemplary of that. I was involved in allegations of a kickback for a major power plant scheme. I reported it to the Inspector General. There were investigations, and I suffered the consequences. I was detained by UN border police. My house was searched and my property taken. And I spent 6 years battling through the system to complain about the fact that the protections that I had as a whistleblower, because I was an official whistleblower, were not afforded me, that they failed me completely. That in fact the accountability institutions of the UN, each and every one of them, failed in my case. And I think that lesson has not been lost on many UN staff, and I think the statistics of the office charged with protecting whistleblowers, which is called the UN Ethics Office, confirm that. And my colleague Shelley Walden has done quite a bit of research on this and can probably speak to those statistics.
Shelley?
Yeah, I'd love to speak to that. Well, first, I should say that in 2012, we did a study where we actually talked to whistleblowers and staff union representatives and other people in the peacekeeping missions. And what we found is there's a real culture of silence and a culture of fear there. So it's great that allegations of sexual abuse are going down in the peacekeeping missions if the misconduct is going down. But if it's because people feel like they're not protected when they come forward, then that's a problem. And I would argue that that's part of the problem here. Police officers, peacekeepers, they have no protections if they blow the whistle at the United Nations. You're only protected if you're a UN staff member. Now, the UN Ethics Office, which Jim was just talking about, they have received over 447 preliminary inquiries from people at the United Nations. They've launched investigations into whistleblower retaliation claims in about 135 of those cases, and they've found in favor of 4 whistleblowers. So 96% of the people who have requested help from retaliation from the UN Ethics Office have not been protected. So whistleblowers feel like if they come forward, like Jim said, their heads are going to be chopped off. Now, about Compass specifically, he is a whistleblower. If you look at the UN whistleblower protection policy, he meets the criteria to be considered a whistleblower by the UN. Those criteria include, so you can go externally if you believe that there's a significant threat to public health or safety as a result of your disclosures, or if there's a violation of national or international law, and if you fear that you're going to be retaliated against if you go through the internal channels. Now, Compass feared that he'd be retaliated against, and I wouldn't blame him if only 4% of whistleblowers are protected, and he actually has been retaliated against from having gone public. So, or not even gone public, from having gone to law enforcement. He went to the people who had the power to act on these allegations. The UN can't prosecute. The French government can prosecute. They needed to know what was going on in order to do something.
James.
I would like to add a little bit to that, in the sense that Compass, he shouldn't be the subject of this conversation.
Absolutely, I was just about to say that, because it's a much broader conversation, and also we're not talking about peacekeeping troops who were under a UN mandate at the time, but we're talking about a general feeling within the United Nations organization. Can people step up? Can they speak out?
And I would give the example of Aisha El-Basri, who recently won a prize for truth-telling, the Ridenauer Prize for truth-telling, who revealed that the UN was complicit in covering up some of the crimes crimes against humanity.
In Sudan, she was based and her job was?
She was the spokesperson, I believe, for the UN mission there.
Right.
And she is the first to say that as a result of what she witnessed in my case, of the fact that I spent years fighting and then ended up having serious consequences, she chose to resign rather than go the route that I chose, because she feared that she would fail and that she would end up suffering serious consequences of retaliation.
Well, speaking of Sudan, we actually got this, Mukesh, I'm going to direct this tweet to you, because we got a tweet from a resident of Sudan. He writes in, this person, Abdul Salam, says, the peacekeepers are just a symbol rather than an active mechanism that's been formed to protect the lives of those who are in danger. And he, of course, is referring to Darfur, he writes. Now, you were the former head of mission there. What is it on the ground that causes reactions like this from actual residents?
I think basically the UN system in its peacekeeping form in Sudan is essentially broken. In fact, violence has gone up in Darfur during the time that UNAMID, the UN mission, has been there. And every day there are abuses going on, and the peacekeepers fail to protect or are involved themselves because of connivance with the Sudanese authorities. So in that sense, and all the reports that Aisha leaked or other reports that have been formed, the UN refuses to do an open inquiry on this. And this is the problem. It's not about defining a person as a whistleblower or not as a whistleblower, but the feeling that the UN system doesn't provide an atmosphere where it can be trusted to investigate misconduct or misdoing. And the system is broken. You can't have a system, you can't have an organization that is both judge and jury by itself.
Yes.
And I think this is the problem. And this will not be solved unless the UN is subjected to external accountability, not its own officials judging itself and deciding whether something is right or wrong.
Okay.
That is why there's a gap between either peoples and we, the UN, that has been created to serve the peoples.
Farhan.
If I may, regarding the case of my colleague Aisha Al-Basri, my fellow spokesperson, the UN actually had been following up on what she said. We actually did commission a study into this, and earlier this year we actually came out with a fairly sober, very frank assessment of our problems there. It's not that we didn't follow up or didn't listen to what she was saying.
You refuse the questions put to the Secretary General. You refuse to answer the questions put to the Secretary General in the inquiry report. The inquiry has never been published. Where is the inquiry?
No, but we shared the findings of that.
Shelley, hold tight, because Farhan can only talk to one person at a time. Farhan, finish up your thoughts.
Yeah, if I may, actually, there's two things I need to address. First of all, regarding that, on Darfur, yes, we do try to follow up, but you need to appreciate the fact that the UN mission in Darfur, the peacekeeping mission for which you worked, has its mandate by the Security Council, and ultimately we have to present this information to the member states of the Security Council and get authorization for them. That ultimately is where the responsibility lies. If I may, before we get off on this, your colleagues, our counterpart Shelley, gave some statistics from the ethics office, and I just wanted to make a clarification because I don't want the statistics to be misused. From August 2006 through July 2014, the ethics office received 401 inquiries relating to whistleblowing and retaliation, but of those, approximately 2/3 of those were requests for information, advice, or referral. They were not complaints as such. So that was 2/3 of that number, 400. Of the remaining 1/3, the ethics office conducted approximately 120 preliminary reviews, and they determined out of that 15 prima facie cases of retaliation. And they've tried to get they tried to get the figures I have is 15.
Okay.
And they tried to get a redress for those. Of those 15, 3 were resolved. 4 were other cases had retaliation established.
Farhan, I appreciate your take on the figures, and Shelley and Farhan, we're not going to go back and forth on figures. Yeah. I think the broader points are really more important than the going back and forth on the figures, particularly when we start getting down to
and I actually have the same figures for the most part, but it still comes down to 96% if you take that 100 number rather than.
Let me push on a little bit. Malika, what do you have to bring into the conversation?
When you talk about making this about the broader point, there's actually a video comment that really hones in on that. So James, I'll play this for you. This is from Joe. Have a listen to what he had to say.
I find it surprising that the United Nations would first appear to cover up such damning behavior, and second, to retaliate against a whistleblower. If releasing this information is a breach of protocol, surely we must consider that on the balance of things, the bigger breach of protocol was the sexual abuse of poor African children by French peacekeepers. So how can ordinary people trust the UN to intervene not only in African conflicts, but anywhere else in the world?
Unfortunately, I would agree with some of that assessment. There is these kinds of incidents do destroy, they seriously harm the UN's reputation, and that's very unfortunate. And partly it's because they don't respond, they don't address the problems, they bury them, they engage in dismissal and denying, cover up, and
why do you think that is, James? Because here I'm looking at the ethics committee here, and it says speak out against misconduct. Have a look here. It actually encourages staff to, here's the number, here's what you have to do, this is what we're looking out for you, we'll protect you. So there's a whole organisation here that says we're here to help you. Why do you feel that that's not working? And then Farhan, I'll come back to you.
I completely agree that that's the policy.
Right.
The practice is very different. And I think the practice is the fact that you have, as Shelley has pointed out, you have 4 cases of whistleblowers who've come forward claiming retaliation, 4 out of whatever the number is, 100, 110, 115, whose cases actually have been validated as retaliatory. And of those 4, 2 were so unhappy with the redress they received that they took those cases to the court system.
So Farhan, the UN's got the policy but not the practice?
Well, the practice actually has to follow the policy. Ultimately, the practice has to be developed. Once the policies are put in place, it takes a while to change the culture, and especially in a bureaucracy that is responsive to so many pressures, to so many member states, to so many different masters as the UN is. But
I
we
think
are
that's
changing the culture. But we are changing the culture, and part of it is when you hear the person who was just talking, the testimony we had heard from in your recording. Part of it is a frustration that has to do with some of the misrepresentations we had a few weeks ago, when people made it sound as if this was UN peacekeepers,
right,
and the UN was sitting on this information. It's the opposite. The UN had the information. They're the ones who uncovered these crimes, these allegations,
as we said at the beginning of this program,
and they gave it to the appropriate prosecuting authorities.
It's much bigger than that one incident. So we're going bigger than that, and that's one situation, and we made it very clear, certainly in this program. Yeah. I've seen a lot of reporting that also made it quite clear, and the UN has been very good at saying this was not a UN mission. Yeah. Mukesh, what did you want to add? Mukesh?
Well, first thing I would say is that I have a lot of sympathy with Farhan, because he's trying to do his job defending the indefensible. The point is that you can't fudge this issue through legal and bureaucratic approaches. This is not picking nits here. These are children, women, and others being exploited by those who are supposed to protect them. And the problem with the UN is, and I found that from my own experience, when I was the head of the United Nations at that time, the UN's biggest program in Sudan. And I found that there's a culture of impunity right at the highest levels in the organization. So we should not blame the UN. The UN is a noble and good institution. It is individual duty bearers in high positions within the organization who make individual decisions. And unless we track those individuals, leaders, head of peacekeeping, and other political leaders within the UN, and not necessarily the Secretary General. I think the current Secretary General has set a very good example. So I don't think we should be, he's the issue here. I think he's ill-served by many, many senior people who actually have a culture, who are immune from discharging their accountability for their jobs. I mean, when you're the head of peacekeeping and there are allegation after allegation of abuse and exploitation by your peacekeepers in country after country after country, at the very least, you should be fired from your job. And we don't have that.
I totally agree with the immunity and impunity point.
When senior members of the staff have actually no incentives to do their job and be accountable, don't be surprised that these things happen again and again and again and again.
Well, Shelly, I hear that you agree, and so I want to direct these two tweets from our community to you. This is Osman, and he says, if peacekeepers are operating in a war-torn country, then obviously there's no one policing over them. They need to be monitored. And Nakul writes, shouldn't the respective countries which send their troops also be held responsible? So my question to you, Shelly, is where should that policing start?
Well, there's a lot of issues here. I mean, one issue is that the UN doesn't prosecute. So the sending states have to prosecute, but they don't usually, well, they often don't report back to the UN whether or not they've even prosecuted. There is more that could be done to hold those sending states accountable and to make them prosecute. One thing is that they could have a blacklist of countries that have failed to prosecute peacekeepers and make that list very public. There's also the possibility of withholding some of the funds that the peacekeeping troops get if that country has not prosecuted the people who have engaged in misconduct. Now, the impunity and immunity points are huge, because I think that one of the reasons that
Shelly,
the UN
right at the end of the show, finish up quickly so I don't leave you mid-sentence.
And that other intergovernmental organizations have such a big problem with this is because they're immune from national courts. No one is looking into and holding them accountable on the level that they
do. You know, I would argue that the most important opinion is the one that we end on and the one that we started on, because if the UN is not able to take all of this passion and then do something with its own staff so they feel empowered, then we've probably wasted our voices. You've wasted your voices. Farhan, would you leave us with one line, because we're almost at the end of this show. Well, where's the UN going with this in terms of ethics and misconduct?
We are trying slowly but surely to build a system where people feel empowered to do exactly that, to speak out. And I'm hoping that what we're creating is a UN where people like Mukesh Kapila and James Wasserstrom, if they were to do the exact same things that they had done before now, would actually get the support that they need.
Shelly Warden, Mukesh Kapila, James Wasserstrom, thank you so much for being part of this program. I'll see you online, stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching. This is the Streams Online Post Show. We've been talking about accusations against the United Nations claiming there is a culture of silence when it comes to revealing abuse or misconduct in its missions. We're getting right back to that conversation. I have to say that Farhan Haq, the deputy spokesperson for the UN Secretary General, had to leave. He had to go and do the rest of his job. But we still have Mukesh and Shelley and James here. This is what I don't get, James, okay? So you speak out against something that's egregious that's happening. Why do you not get fast-tracked and promoted? Why is it that speaking out is career suicide?
Because the organization has a culture of circling the wagons against people who speak out like this. They basically close ranks, and they somehow believe that protects the interests of the organization against interlopers like myself.
But you were UN. You're not an interloper.
Of course, and a loyal international civil servant for 28 years. So it wasn't as if this happened overnight.
Yeah.
And what's sad about that is that the judge, in my case, at one point he wrote that the person who had the interests of the organization at heart was me. But I'm the one who suffered the gravest consequences for coming forward, and those who were involved in the allegations suffered none whatsoever.
See, Mukesh, for outsiders, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense why that you and James shouldn't be right up there leading the UN in major agencies because of how courageous you were and also how honest you are. How did you make it make sense for you when you spoke up, things happened badly for you career-wise?
Well, things happened to me badly career-wise, absolutely.
Yeah.
Essentially lost my job as head of the UN in Sudan. But what happened was that the world at least recognized that what was going on in Darfur was genocide and events that unfolded accordingly. Now, I wish that my bosses at that particular time, that included Kofi Annan, the then Secretary General, and senior Under-Secretary Generals, had actually backed me up, but I had absolutely no backing at all. I have no regrets at what I did, because my job was less important than the lives of the millions of people that were affected, that I was charged to protect. I think it's very, very important that we don't take this conversation as an anti-UN conversation. I have never felt bitter about the UN, and I'm the first person to passionately defend the UN. My argument is with individual duty bearers in the organization. The greatest murder that we know, the greatest crime against all humanity took place when the first genocide of the 21st century took place in Darfur. And yet the people in charge in the UN system at that particular time, in senior positions, actually got promoted. And Kofi Annan himself got the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, when you have actual signals in the system that rewards you for for circling the wagons, as James just very nicely put it, then don't be surprised that these things happen again and again and again. That is why I keep on saying the system cannot be fixed from within. We need to do at the UN level, but what enlightened governments are doing at the state level. There are many, many good practices from the more enlightened governments around the world. Why is it that the UN cannot practice those forms of transparency and accountability, not in the future? And I think Farhan was saying we're slowly beginning to do practice. Maybe in a few decades, the situation will improve. That's nonsense. And to have complacency because the numbers are drifting downwards is rubbish. It is simply that we are not getting as many reports out from the field because people are afraid, and also people don't have a clear way of actually reporting these kinds of things. And I'm here not talking about an abstract definition of what is a whistleblower. I'm here talking about the misconduct that goes over all the place. Final point I want to make, if I may. It is important in ensuring that this is not seen as an anti-UN conversation. In fact, having gone to many crisis and humanitarian situations throughout my life, many other international organizations, the prevalence of misconduct in those international organizations is as prevalent as in the UN itself. And that includes, by the way, many major NGOs. So anyone out there from an NGO world or a non-UN world, if is smugly sitting there thinking this only happens in the UN, then they should better look out. Terrible things are going on in crisis situations. Every time, look at what's going on in Nepal at the present time in earthquake relief. And these are not just the military peacekeepers who do these abuses. These are also humanitarian aid workers who should, words fail me in describing the greatest betrayal that you can make is to exploit and abuse the most vulnerable people you find on the ground. Sure, we're talking about UN military peacekeepers at the present time, but this is a wider problem of crisis and conflict situations, and the humanitarian industry itself has to get its act in order on an equal basis to what we've been talking about. And the whole thing has to be taken together.
Mukesh, our community really hears your impassioned words and what you're saying. And so that begs this question from CL, and I'll direct this to you, James. This is on Twitter, and CL writes, what is the status quo of abuse now? Is it normal to keep quiet, or is action taken against the abusers discreetly if reported? I know that you hear from people who often want to report instances of abuse. What happens?
There are people who really would like to come forward, but they recognize the consequences. So as a result, because the UN has basically shut down the avenues that they say they're trying to promote, people will then.
How have they done that, James? Because if I look here on the Ethics Committee website here, look down here, it says protection against retaliation for reporting misconduct. It actually says we will look after you.
Yes, but I think the example of my case and so many others that have not got quite the attention that mine did,
right,
speaks much louder than those words.
Than the words, right?
Yeah.
Just
they have a horrible.
Retaliation takes subtle forms. Retaliation takes subtle forms. You're basically not promoted. You are sidelined. You are shunted away somewhere. Yeah. So it's not about retaliation in a sense of losing your job. It is basically, and worse than that, is actually being marginalized.
Although I think that, James, you've got the most extreme retaliation story, because what happened to you when you tried to leave Kosovo?
Well, I was arrested at the border,
right,
with Macedonia. I was taken by UN police back to my house, where they then did an illegal search and seizure of my property. So then my name was blasted into the media by, I'm sure it was leaked by you, or I'm not sure, but I assume that it was leaked by the UN. In Kosovo, and I was afraid for my life, and it really was a devastating experience that went on for years.
I hate to keep asking you about it, because this then becomes one of the things that you now become an expert on because of your own experience. That moment when you were arrested, did you have any qualms about what you had done? Do you wish that maybe you hadn't said anything?
I've never regretted. I think, as Mukesh has said, I've never regretted my decision to do what I did. I'm also often asked, when did I decide to do what I did? And I don't ever remember making a conscious decision during this entire period. It was just the right thing to do. This was the right thing to do, and I felt this was what I had to do to protect my own integrity. And that may sound trite or cliche, but it's really the way I felt.
Sure.
And that's why I spent 6 years battling the organization and the court system.
Shelley, you've been trying to get in for a little while. Go ahead. What do you want to say?
I mean, there's a lot of different points I wanted to say, but the retaliation against Jim was extreme, but a lot of whistleblowers at the United Nations have been retaliated against in similar ways. And whistleblowers, I didn't get a chance to say this earlier, but they're so important. I mean, a study by PricewaterhouseCoopers of companies worldwide found that they detect more fraud than corporate security audits, rotation of personnel, fraud risk management, and law enforcement combined. So you have to protect whistleblowers. And unfortunately at the UN, too many people lose their jobs when they come forward. They go to the ethics office thinking they'll be protected. Only 4% of them, if that, are. So they go to the UN internal justice system thinking they'll be protected. That's the internal court system for UN employees. The first court does sometimes protect them and find in favor of them, and then it gets appealed to the UN Appeals Tribunal, which never finds in favor of whistleblowers. It just throws out the case.
Is there anything unusual about the way the UN operates that makes it a special case? Because we often say the UN, and I think many people forget it's member states. It's all of our individual countries. It's not, we the people are responsible for what we ask our UN to do.
And I think
sorry, Shelley, go ahead.
It's fine. I mean, it is member states, and there are political factors that, sometimes come into play here. But I think the problem is that it is an internal court system. The UN, even though they claim to have independent judges, really they're paid for by the UN. So what we would love to see is external arbitration in whistleblower cases, or a court system just for intergovernmental organization employees, because this isn't only a problem at the UN, it's a problem at the World Bank, at the Inter-American Development Bank, and all these other organizations that have their own internal tribunals, and that's a problem.
I think it is the shabbiest position that the UN takes, where it hides behind member states. Sure, member states come in many shapes and sizes, and some are more or less enlightened in certain things. But the United Nations system, with its tens of thousands of employees, is an autonomous body. The individual UN official is extraterritorial. So when the UN says, oh, well, it's the member states and this and that, etc., what they're doing is they are providing themselves with an alibi behind the member states. No UN state is saying to the UN, go about raping and abusing. No UN state says, do this, that, and the other. And I think we expect from the leaders of the UN leadership, not just moral leadership, it goes without saying, which comes from the Charter, but also practical and operational leadership. And a problem we have is a lack of courage.
It's hard to believe that we've been speaking for 45 minutes and there's so much more I know all of our guests have to say. James, what did you want to squeeze in before the internet window closes in like 1 minute's time?
Yes, no, absolutely. I also object to this false choice that that's member states and that we can't do anything other than go along with what member states who are backing the UN. They're the ones who drive this.
Right.
There's the political aspect and then there's the management aspect. But we're not talking about a political aspect like changing the makeup of the Security Council. That's very complicated. We're talking about actions that are wholly within the jurisdiction and power of the management of the organization. That does not require member states. That requires just sound, strong leadership and sound, strong management.
I've got to be honest, when we had Farhan Haq here during the main program, I didn't actually hear him necessarily disagree with you. There was a little quibbling about stats, but I didn't hear him saying, we've got it right. I heard him saying, we're working on it. What else are people saying, Malika, about the UN?
I'll leave you with this because, as you mentioned at the top of the show, we do have UN members who are watching this show. This is from Barakat, who says he served in a UN mission before, and he says, while the idea is great, there are multiple shortcomings, he admits. But then there is this tweet here from Maggie. This is really only one that I've seen so far of this kind, but I know there are others out there who think this. Maggie says, if you think others can do better, let UN forces come home, and you lot protect those people like you should have been doing. And I think, of course, she's talking about some of those member countries.
James Wasserstrom, Mukesh Kapila, Shelley Warden, thank you very much for being part of this conversation. I really appreciate your time today. Meanwhile, on our next show, what's going on in Macedonia? This weekend, an anti-terrorism operation by the government left 20 dead and even more uncertainty for the country's future. We'll discuss this on our next A-Day stream. Until then, take care.